Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. With new pro-business presidents in Latin America, human rights and environment are in peril. Our guest, Gimena Sánchez, Director for the Andes Program at WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America. Gimena Sánchez, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Gimena, in recent days, the New York Times has published an article basically saying that Brazilian President Bolsonaro wants to ransack the Amazonia and said, don't let him. And the article concludes that the new president of Brazil has put human rights and environment in peril. It's true?
Yes, he has. During Bolsonaro's campaign, he made his thoughts about indigenous people and Afro-descendants very clear, basically saying that they were savages or that they were uneducated, or that they needed to be forcibly integrated into the country, into the real Brazil. Since he's taken office, he's actually taken steps to advance that ideology by first transferring the rights that are protected by indigenous people by an agency that was set up to do that under the Ministry of Agriculture. The Ministry of Agriculture is currently run by somebody who comes from those landed agro-business interests. Also, he has basically made it very clear that he's not going to demarcate any new lands for indigenous people, and that he's also going to be looking at defunding the quilombolas. So the land titling agency went from having about $20 million to now having $3 million.
And in the case of the deforestation that you were mentioning, 90% of them is a result of the agribusiness. And there are two main U.S. companies that are mentioned in the article of the New York Times. The U.S. knows exactly that basically it's not really helping to keep the environment as it should.
Yes, so recently Bolsonaro and Trump met at the White House. They had a private meeting, but one of the things that came out was that the USAID, the International Cooperation Agency for the U.S., signed a major accord with Brazil so that private interests could further their interest in the Amazon. What is really problematic is that Brazil, for a period of time, from 2004 to 2017, had actually managed to reforest a significant amount of the Amazon, basically because it took environmental policies very seriously and it made itself a leader on the issues of climate change. And now, even before Bolsonaro took office, we saw a significant increase in deforestation of about 17.5%. And we've also seen a message given to illegal miners, loggers, and others who want to do land grabs, that if they do so, they will be doing so with impunity. At least 8 of the demarcated indigenous reserves, for example, have been under attack or have had illegal squatters in their land. We've seen an increase of threats and intimidation against indigenous leaders.
What is the situation of the indigenous people in general in Brazil?
Well, the situation in Brazil is that you have 305 different indigenous groupings. I think about 100 of them that are considered groups that haven't been contacted. And these indigenous millennial people basically are the stewards of the Amazon rainforest, which is basically the Earth's lungs and is how most of the CO2 is made into oxygen in the world. And now these very people are in a situation where they're more than likely going to have the territories that haven't been demarcated not given to them, and then those that have the territories have large dams built into them or other forms of large development projects, in addition to logging that is going to significantly alter the environment and lead to dramatic shifts in terms of climate change.
So what to expect for the balance of the presidency of Bolsonaro?
Well, what we think is that while Bolsonaro's rhetoric and even the actions he's taken so far are very drastic, that there are sectors within Brazilian society, especially in the agro business, that see this as bad for business. and they've actually been pushing back. So for example, if Brazil wants good engagement with the European Union or with Norway that provides funding for protection of the Amazon, they're going to have to basically not see development in the environment as just a clash, but a way of doing development that is most sustainable. So the hope is that first, the legislature is not going to see a lot of these policies through. He can still do a lot of damage, but he needs the legislator to be able to advance things. And then secondly, that there's going to be major pushback, both from the international community, but also from the rather strong environmental movement that exists in Brazil.
And if so much harm is being done to human rights and indigenous people and also to the environment, why the media is not really denouncing that in Brazil?
Well, in the case of the media, we see that there are a lot of vested interests behind a lot of these projects. And so it's not in their interest to raise awareness of what's going on there. It's better to show that there is development or what have you, which is really a misnomer because it's unsustainable development that actually will lead to hampering economic development in the long run, as well as great ecological damage.
So how would you compare the situation in terms of how grave, how dangerous is the situation in Brazil in terms of human rights and also environment with the one in Colombia, for example?
I think both situations are from a scale of 1 to 10, probably a 10. The case of Colombia, in particular on human rights, the big issue is the more than 485 social leaders that have been killed since the signing of the peace accord, with a disproportionate number of them being indigenous and Afro descendants, precisely because they are defending land rights. They are resisting large-scale development projects or rampant resource extraction without any sort of environmental sustainability in their territories. And currently, right now in Colombia, there's a mass demonstration taking place of all of the indigenous groups in most of the country because of the situation, because they're seeing major rollbacks in terms of their rights and also far more pressure on their territories. In terms of Brazil, some of the analysts are saying that what has happened just in the past few months with Bolsonaro is basically shifting back the environmental and the indigenous policies of the last 30 years, which is pretty tremendous, and that unless this is somehow stopped or controlled, that this is going to have irreparable consequences.
The killing of social leaders in Colombia, they say that the average is 1 every 2 days.
Yeah.
Who's killing them, and why we don't know what's behind?
Well, Colombia during 2007 saw the final demobilization of the Federation of Paramilitaries that it had there, the Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. So this was painted basically by the Colombian government as a complete demobilization of 30,000 people. The problem is that most of them either regrouped and formed new groups that the Colombian government says are not paramilitaries, but just criminal bands linked to drug trafficking. That is very disputed. They've even had to call them illegal armed groups because they're not sure how to categorize them. For most of the people living out in all of these areas where these people are present, for them, first, in many cases, it's the same people. So they see the same faces that have just been recycled, or they see that who was at the medium level commander is now the commander, or what have you. And so for them, they're paramilitaries. Most of the killings that are taking place are being committed by these folks. And there are some questions as to one of the groups called the Águilas Negras, as to whether that may actually be a group that is linked somehow to Colombian military and intelligence, just because of the level of sophistication of how they're able to follow people and so forth. Others are killed by hired guns. Unfortunately, the inequality in Colombia and the lack of employment for people leads people to sometimes be paid just $100, $200 to assassinate someone they don't even know.
What is the situation in La Guajira?
La Guajira is basically a peninsula in the north of Colombia. where you have the largest open pit carbon mine. This is an environmental disaster because the company for years has deviated rivers in order to use the water for the purposes of the mine. And what you see there is a whole infrastructure set up for the carbon company and everything related to it and everyone related to that, and then indigenous people in absolute poverty. As a result of not having access to water, the Wayuu don't have potable water, they don't have water to be able to grow anything, and you're seeing chronic malnutrition taking place and a large number of children dying, as well as the elderly. This is a case that has been brought internationally because there are so many that have been dying. The response of the Colombian government has been to employ basically a set of contractors to give water to the indigenous, which is kind of very logistically difficult because of the remoteness. But we're even seeing that that doesn't get to people because many of those contracts are often contracts that are given to people where they siphon off a good number of the funds, and so even that is not helping. And
you have been recently in Colombia. You were witnessing areas where fighting is still going on.
I was recently in Arauca, which is the department right on the border with Venezuela. And in Arauca, since Duque has taken office in August and announced that he doesn't want basically to advance with the ELN dialogues, there's been an upping of operations. You've seen live combat operations, you've seen significant number of bombings. I was present when a bomb went off just one block away from me. And you're seeing a situation of complete desperation for the civil society living there because there's this stigma that Arauca is a guerrilla territory, and so the civil society is all being branded that way, and so they're subjected to mistreatment often by the military and the police.
In Colombia,
yes.
At least 7.5 million displaced, the internal displaced, the largest in the world after Syria, with awful social issues that those people are living. Tell us about that.
Well, it's a bit disheartening to see President Iván Duque travel the world, mostly here to the United States, and speak about a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela and about migrants in Colombia and they're needing food and shelter and what have you, when in his own country he has 8 million internally displaced people from the conflict, many of whom are living in shanty towns around all of the major cities and are in a situation really without much help. In the area of Llano Verde in Cali, for example, that holds about 30,000 displaced people, I was recently there. We're seeing a situation where the displaced people themselves are giving the little that they have to Venezuelan migrants while they're not even getting anything from the government. People are in such desperate straits that we see that many are being recruited into the drug trade or recruited into illegal armed groups or into prostitution out of a need to survive.
Talking about when the election took place and Iván Duque won the presidency, there was admission that is about 240,000 hectares planted with coca leaf. Yes. How threatening for the environment and for the social network of the country is that situation?
Well, Colombia, prior to the peace accord, basically with the financing of the United States, had an anti-narcotics policy that included basically militarizing those areas where the coca was present, and at the same time fumigating it with glyphosate through contractors. That policy was stopped basically because it wasn't working. You saw the coca spreading from certain parts of the country to throughout the entire part of the country, and at the same time that the coca was being spread after it was fumigated to new areas, the areas that had been fumigated are completely destroyed. So people's food source is destroyed, basically their water is polluted, and it's very hard to grow things back in those areas. So it wasn't working. You still had coca, you still had coca produced into cocaine and going to the United States. So the accord with the FARC includes a drug chapter called Chapter 4 that specifically tried to address this the best way possible by making contracts with a lot of the coca farmers, basically that they will self-eradicate the coca if they get basic
an alternative
and so forth. Because when you speak to a farmer in one of these areas, they'll tell you the coca is great because they'll come and buy it right in front of my house. If I make bananas or what have you, I don't even have a road to take it to the nearest town, and by the time I get there, those bananas are basically rotten. And so, you know, how do you compete with that? However, they felt that they didn't want to be growing coca. They're growing coca because it's the only thing that's giving them any sort of an income. They would rather do bananas, so they asked the government to please build a road or help us have some kind of a market or infrastructure so that we can sell that, even though we'll make less money. All of these agreements were signed, and what have we seen? Duque, since he's been in office, yes, they've honored the agreements, but they're not making new agreements. They haven't given the full payments that they are supposed to, and they're also advocating for going back to a policy of aerial fumigation of the coca crop. And so some of the farmers have started regrowing for fear that that's what's going to take place. And we've also seen a high number of coca farmers, those who basically activated these networks to do this plan, killed.
Do that percentage of the population, we're talking about like 8 million displaced, we're talking about indigenous people, Afro-Colombian people, do they find representation in some political capacity? There are some representatives in the political election, for example?
So one of the reasons that you had such a protracted long conflict in Colombia is because the two major political parties made a pact, basically, to shift power from one to the other. During the Uribe era, there was a proliferation of new parties, but basically they were Uribista parties, but basically to be able to enter into politics, to be able to even have a platform where you can be heard, you need to have so much money that it's almost impossible. And so one of the things about the peace accord was to make political participation far more equitable. And so now you have the FARC party that has, they have 10 seats, but they have 8 representatives. But you also had plans to have quotas for victims in the victims areas so that you have better representation. And what has happened? Basically, the Colombian government under Duque has stopped all those efforts.
So in reality, it's a large percentage of the population that they don't feel that their voice is represented in the politics of the country.
And then with the Constitution of Colombia, there were 2 quotas, the new Constitution and the laws for Afro-descendants. There were 2 seats set up for Afro-descendants. And initially there were Afro-descendants in those seats, but then the traditional political parties found a way to maneuver it so that they could have non-Afro-descendants in those seats. So even the designated seats for those populations have been usurped by the political system.
Gimena, what are the things that WOLA is looking with more attention of that situation in Brazil and Colombia?
Well, our major concern are the lives of the social leaders. U.S. military assistance to Colombia has human rights conditions that State Department and Congress need to monitor. Portion of the aid can be frozen because Colombia is not protecting social leaders, so that's a big part of it. And then in terms of Brazil, we're just concerned about almost this whole rollback and attacks on all of civil society in Brazil, not just the indigenous, but also LGBT people. There's been massive onslaught against them and a high rate of hate crimes against them. With Afro-descendants, we're also seeing that the security policies of the Bolsonaro administration was basically shoot first and ask questions later, and the idea of arming everyone is disproportionately affecting poorer people, and especially Afro-descendants in the favelas. There are about 76% of those homicides that take place, and recently we saw an attack in a favela where 13 people who had basically already, given themselves in, killed after they were gave themselves in.
Gimena Sánchez, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.